Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Federal Policy Plenary. Once again, Bryce McKibben, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy. In this plenary session, we're going to go over some of the basics of Federal Policy 101, how it gets made and affects student basic needs through the various branches of Congress, or so branches of Congress and and the administration and the courts. Then we'll take a little bit of a deep dive into some of the key developments that have impacted student basic needs over the last few years. As soon as I'm done with that presentation, I'm going to bring in a great colleague of mine, Ernest Ezeugo, who is a strategy officer for federal policy at the Lumina Foundation, for a back and forth conversation on what he thinks are some of the timely, important areas where both Congress and the administration can make progress to affect student basic needs and college affordability. He's someone who has a wealth of experience in this area, and I'll introduce him in a little bit. So just to begin with the basics on the different levers that we have available to change the trajectory and create systemic change for students. I want to start off by mentioning that Congress probably has an outsized role here in its power of the purse. But many folks don't know that law is created in two very distinct ways. One, through authorizing committees like the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, or the House Education and Labor Committee, and through appropriations, which is the provision of the actual money to back up what most of those authorizing committees establish as federal law. The appropriations committees are in the House and Senate, the subcommittees for Health and Human Services, Education, Labor, and related agencies, a real mouthful. But these two twin avenues for making policy deal with essentially creating the umbrella of the law and then providing the actual money to make an impact and actually execute those laws. There are a couple of exceptions that it doesn't make sense to go into, where things are either an entitlement spending or happen automatically. The student loan program is one of those, and that does not require Congress to provide annual appropriations to make it happen. It happens automatically, a little bit like Social Security and Medicaid. However, for the purposes of our conversation today and the things that we're going to be talking about on college affordability, this basic structure of authorizing and appropriating is the main thing to keep in mind. On the administration side, there are even more levers available to make change. Most of you probably familiar with federal agencies that are involved in administering public benefits programs or our federal financial aid programs. We have the U.S. Department of Education as one of those agencies, is one of probably the most important when it comes to impacting student basic needs. But each of these agencies have different powers and levers within them. Agencies can interpret the law that Congress passes within reason and within the bounds of case law. They can also decide to implement in different ways and make choices within the laws that Congress has established, taking care to execute in a timely fashion and stand up things that people experience on a day-to-day basis. Classic example might be the laws that articulate our federal financial aid system get represented to students and to colleges in the form of the FAFSA, which the Department of Education runs. And then the rules are established and interpreted for financial aid administrators on the back end. And then to help further reduce any gray area that might exist in the law, or to help make it a little bit clearer how it looks on the ground, agencies can issue guidance. And this is often a way of interpreting federal law that's been established by Congress that might be a little bit vague. Agencies issue guidance all the time in order to elucidate the things that Congress might have left as open questions, either unintentionally or unintentionally. In many cases, this is really important for people to be able to understand the law in layman's terms, to be able to execute and be able to provide assistance to students in the way that it was intended. And then lastly, and sort of more formally in this type of federal rulemaking or federal policymaking, is the rulemaking process. This means a federal regulation is established by an agency. This can be a pretty weedy and wonky process, as Ernest knows and might be able to give us a little bit of information on. But it definitely involves a drawn out process that is supposed to be transparent and involve outside stakeholders. regulations by the US Department of Education that impact the federal financial aid programs go through a negotiated rulemaking process. So you get a stakeholder group that comes together, discusses federal policy and how the regulations should be crafted, tries to come up with them, and even getting into the nitty-gritty of different clauses and subclauses, and then eventually puts that rule out for public comment. Other agencies simply just need to go to public comment briefly, and then the rule becomes effective quickly thereafter. But it does differ by agency. In the most cases, the things that are going to have impact on student basic needs and have the most profound impact on student basic needs security is going to be through US Department of Education negotiated rulemaking on the regulatory side. Guidance is also really important. In order to interpret some of the laws that Congress has recently passed that impact student basic needs, we'll talk about in a minute, like the FAFSA Simplification Act. And then also within the administration, it's worth mentioning the importance of the White House. The president and his advisors are also key leaders in being able to coordinate efforts between federal agencies to ensure that they execute the priorities of the president, vice president. The White House, through its Office of Management and Budget, also issues a budget every year that articulates its vision for how Congress should spend and allocate resources, taxpayer resources, for their priorities. Right now, the Biden-Harris administration is in the process of finalizing their fiscal year 2024 budget proposal, which will be out next year, and hopefully will contain some important updates and improvements for student basic needs security. Lastly, we won't be touching on this session, but obviously one of the three branches of government are the courts and the judiciary. We did mention that briefly in our previous session on reproductive justice and abortion care, that certainly the courts can have a significant impact on student basic needs security through their rulings, and certainly just a broader impact on students writ large. But since I am not a lawyer and we won't be talking about a legal strategy, we'll save that particular discussion for another time. Now to dive in just a little bit deeper, that you've had an overview of the different levers of change into the different authorizing and appropriations developments that have happened in recent memory if impact student basic needs. First of all, it's kind of impressive that Congress has been able to move forward with a number of pieces of legislation in the last couple of years that do impact the financial security of people across the country as well as students in an otherwise relatively gridlocked environment. Beginning with the Future Act in 2019, Congress provided the first ever permanent funding for HBCUs, minority serving institutions, and tribal colleges that had ever been established. Previously, it always had an expiration date. And it established some data sharing that has yet to come online, but is going to be prove very consequential to streamline the Department of Education and the Treasury Department sharing information about students' tax information, their family tax information, to make it a lot easier for them to fill out the FAFSA. The FAFSA Simplification Act, which was then built on the Future Act, had an incredible number of changes that are relevant to student basic needs conversation. This law was the product of years of long debate on how to simplify the FAFSA, reduce its number of questions, but also not just to change the form itself, but the actual underpinnings of the financial aid formula and who is eligible for federal student aid, including Pell Grants and student loans. Ultimately, the law made about 555,000 additional students eligible for Pell Grants and about 1.7 million additional students eligible for the maximum grant relative to what was the case before. That'll be fully going online by 2024, but as we'll talk about in a minute, has some other interim steps that need to go through implementation. The financial aid reforms, the student aid formula reforms, also have a significant impact on single parents. There's a new formula that will allow single parents in particular to have a more generous Pell Grant eligibility determination and become eligible for additional aid. The law protects more income that a student might be earning while they're working part-time and going to school. It reinstated eligibility for incarcerated students to be able to get Pell Grants, which had been banned for a long time, since 1994. And perhaps most importantly, it requires the Department of Education to include a range of public benefits on the FAFSA that students can check a box and say they have received or not, and to work with other agencies to notify students about benefits they have not yet received. That's, again, something that will be going online here in a couple of years. After the FAFSA Simplification Act, there have been two other recent bills that have passed in the last year that you may not think of as directly related to federal financial aid or student basic needs, but do have a significant impact on students. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, as it's sometimes called, or it was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a bipartisan law, codified what is called the Affordable Connectivity Program. It allows any student eligible for a Pell Grant to receive free broadband internet service. If you're wondering where to find out information about that and how to share it with your students, you can go to getinternet.gov. It's a resource we'll share after this session, but it could have a transformative impact on students who don't have broadband internet access at home. And then the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act codified healthcare and health insurance subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, which can have a significant impact on a student's financial stability. A single parent who's making about $75,000 a year, for example, can save up to $5,600 per year on their health insurance subsidies or health insurance coverage. And a young adult who's making about $40,000 a year, who was already eligible for heavily subsidized coverage under the ACA, could save an additional $1,100 per year. That could have a significant impact on students' ability to afford college. Legislation that hasn't yet passed, but is still really important for us to pay attention to, and which the Hope Center is actively involved in, includes a massive bipartisan mental health reform effort. Both chambers of Congress have shown a bipartisan interest in the mental health affecting individuals across the country, but particularly students in higher education. And I know this was discussed in one of the breakout sessions that you'll be able to review later if you didn't attend, on mental health and suicide prevention. The House of Representatives have passed a number of bills out of their chamber that address mental health, and some of which address the programs that affect mental health for students in higher education. There are some provisions in the Higher Education Act that do touch student mental health, and the Garrett Lee Smith program run out of HHS that is the only federal investment in college students' mental health, but is a very small program and significantly underfunded. The Senate has not yet released its own version of the mental health package or mental health reform. It is still working on producing a bipartisan product, and we are hoping there might be something released this fall that reflects a bipartisan commitment, even if Congress might run out of time before a new Congress comes into town in January to be able to complete this law. But sometimes there is late-breaking efforts in Congress during the quote-unquote lame duck period between an election and a new Congress, where bipartisan spirit breaks through and hope remains alive for that particular legislation. Next on the pending list would be the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill handles all nutrition programs that Congress funds and authorizes. But most importantly for our conversation would be the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance, or SNAP program. The Farm Bill does touch the SNAP program, and every 5 years or so, Congress takes up the Farm Bill to try to reauthorize and modify its key provisions. The Congress is actually in that window right now and started earlier this year holding hearings to reauthorize the Farm Bill and deal with the many challenging policy issues that are confronting recipients of SNAP. Obviously, students have a tremendous difficulty in accessing SNAP benefits, primarily because of outdated work requirements, outdated and harmful work requirements that exist to keep students out of the program, which there is significant energy to modify. Legislation's been introduced in both chambers, like the EATS Act by Representative Jimmy Gomez and the Student Food Security Act by Senator Elizabeth Warren, which would improve student eligibility for SNAP and remove harmful work requirements. Those proposals would be considered over the next year as Congress works on SNAP, on the Farm Bill reauthorization. And then lastly, possibly living in the more amorphous side of potential things that happen in could happen in legislative scenario would be HEA reauthorization conversations. The Higher Education Act hasn't been reauthorized since 2008, but as I've just mentioned, there have been pretty substantial overhauls to things that affect the HEA, or laws that are connected to the HEA, like the Future Act and the FAFSA Simplification Act. But eventually, Congress will need to return to do some cleanup work on our overall structure of access, affordability, and accountability rules that undergird the Higher Education Act. Because of ongoing partisan disagreements in Congress over the direction and the role and the size of the federal government when it comes to higher education, most folks think that the Higher Education Act is not likely to be reauthorized soon, and that it would take quite a bit of a change in the current political atmosphere for Congress to be able to reach agreement on an HEA reauthorization. But as we'll get to in a little bit, the administration still has quite a bit of authority and power to implement some of the laws affecting the HEA. And so despite the fact that HEA might be stalled, it doesn't necessarily mean policymaking on higher education is at all stalled. It's a key difference to keep in mind. Now we'll talk a little bit about the funding elements of student basic needs. I mentioned earlier that the appropriations committees are the ones that, or subcommittees are the ones that handle providing the actual money behind implementing federal law that the authorizers establish. Just a reminder that a federal fiscal year goes from September 1st of each year to October 30th the following. So we are now in the fiscal year 2023 because new fiscal year began I have that actually wrong. New fiscal year ends on September 30th and then begins on October 1. Apologies on that one. So we're actually coming up on the end of the fiscal year at the end of this month, and we will begin fiscal year 2023 starting on October 1. One interesting development that's happened in the last couple of years has been the return of what were called earmarks, or is now called congressionally directed spending. This is a very small piece of the federal funding pie that Congress can actually allocate directly to specific projects in their states and in their districts. Why that's relevant is that we've seen an actual number of basic needs improvements and college projects that impact student basic needs security inserted into the appropriations bills, including in the recent fiscal year 2023 bill and in the draft ones for in the recent fiscal year 2022 bill and in the draft bills that have been out for FY23. So colleges, as they think about how they advocate for their students and how students think about how they affect change, might consider advocating for earmarks that impact student basic needs or provide funding for specific projects that could support students' non-tuition costs. Appropriators also have the ability to include alongside their funding a report and different language that changes the law on these must-pass vehicles. This is considered kind of strong nudging to federal agencies, or in some cases actually being able to amend pieces of law. This can have a pretty substantial and profound impact just by little tweaks here and there, or little choices of language that do change the trajectory of federal policymaking in substantial ways. And just in the fiscal year 2022 bill, there was a tremendous amount of progress, and a couple of things I'll just highlight here. In our Parenting Students panel earlier today, you probably heard about or will hear about when you listen, the Child Care Access Means Parents in School program, the only federal investment for campus childcare. That program got a $10 million boost in the fiscal year 2022 bill. The bill also lifted, through bill language, the maximum grant cap that exists on the CCAMS program, which is far outdated and used to say an institution could only get 1% of its Pell funds for childcare, which is just dramatically lower when we know that about 25% of all 25% of all undergraduate students are parents. So it was an important step to lift that cap. We need to go further to make sure it's actually implemented. Congress also boosted funding for the Basic Needs Grant Program, the only program that's specifically targeted at institutions' reforms to improve student basic needs security. And it hiked the Pell Grant by $500, added new funding for the campus-based aid programs, including $15 million to SEOG and $20 million to work study. Work study is a huge part of basic needs because students who are eligible for federal work study under current flexibilities are also automatically eligible for SNAP, assuming they meet the income requirements. They do not have to work 20 hours per week on work study. And once the public health emergency subsides, any student who's still receiving or currently receiving work study or receives work study in the future will also be able to maintain their eligibility for SNAP. Now, as I mentioned, on October 1, we're going to enter fiscal year 23. We are waiting for Congress to essentially resolve that question by being able to pass the draft bills that have been introduced in the House and Senate, many of which also have additional increases of student basic needs, and then to move forward by the end of the month just to kick the can essentially on a continuing resolution or CR until mid-December. This is really merely a technicality that just keeps the lights on, avoids a government shutdown until the election can be resolved. And then I think sometime probably in December is what most folks would expect. Congress would pass what is known as an omnibus, word I've used to just mean a sort of roll up of all government funding that hopefully would fund the rest of fiscal year 23. Now, to turn to the Biden-Harris administration and some of the things that they can do or have done, rather, to improve student basic needs security. First, I think the most notable one is that Congress allocated $77 billion in COVID relief funds to institutions of higher education and to students over the course of the pandemic. That includes about $40 billion in emergency aid grants that went to students. And the administration had to implement this law very quickly, an unprecedented infusion of money directly to colleges through the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, or HEERF. The Biden-Harris administration in particular issued guidance that allowed campuses to clearly use their institutional funds that they got under HEERF for basic needs improvements, like creating a basic needs hub on campus or expanding mental health services or referring students to public benefits. This was really, really critical in making sure that this money could go to the most important needs that students have on campus. And then just earlier this year, they rolled out, using their authority to take a portion of the funds for extreme needs, $198 million under the SSARP program, or the Supplemental Support under the American Rescue Plan Act. That $198 million was then distributed to some of the highest need colleges, many of which were using it for basic needs supports in their campuses. And we commend the administration for their work on this. Also in January this year, it's probably mentioned a few of your sessions, and we'll expand on it further. The administration issued guidance that it very clearly allows FAFSA data to be used to help connect students to public benefits programs. This is really important when we think about the programs like SNAP or the Affordable Connectivity Program, Get Free Internet, or Affordable Care Act coverage, that the colleges on the ground now have clearly written into guidance, one of the levers available to federal policymakers, to be able to refer from these public benefits and help them cover their non-tuition costs. We're so grateful for that guidance, and we're really looking forward to seeing it implemented by more colleges across the country and helping spread the word. Next, and I realize we're getting a lot of information here thrown at you, but I want to make sure you have the full range of information about what the administration is up to. Just want to briefly mention that, of course, the administration is administering grant competitions. It's opening them, establishing the eligibility and priorities for them, and recently conducted and closed a competition for the C-Campus program. Two more programs of interest are currently open and accepting applications. The Basic Needs Grant Program, with applications due October 3rd, is specifically for institutions to be able to implement systemic solutions to student basic needs security on their campus, like referring students to public benefits programs or surveying students and their basic needs. And there's a $5 million fund available for campuses that are implementing evidence-based solutions to improve student retention and completion. And given the profound impact of helping students meet their basic needs on student success, many basic needs interventions are eligible for that fund as well. Turning a little bit towards the things the administration can do on some of the financial aid changes coming up, I'll highlight the FAFSA Simplification Act. Again, I went over those a little bit earlier, some of those changes. They are in various stages of progress. We have had significant steps just in the last year to remove, for example, the questions related to selective service and drug convictions for students. That has a significant impact on millions of students' ability to access the FAFSA in the first place. And for the upcoming award year for the FAFSA, which will be going online on October 1st, it's unclear a little bit yet which provisions the Department of Education will be implementing on FAFSA that also might help significant populations of students, including students experiencing homelessness, students who are not in contact with their parents or estranged from their parents who can't provide their own parental income, or cost of attendance provisions that are going to provide significant transparency around non-tuition college costs. We're still waiting to see exactly which things the Secretary of Education plans to implement for that award year. And then major overhauls to the federal financial aid formula will go online for award year 24-25. That's the FAFSA that goes online next October 2023. Lastly, just covering the Department of Education, brief mention because it's kind of an elephant in the room. there's a lot going on at the Department of Education. Not only have I already articulated it, but there is a massive amount of policymaking happening at the Department of Education, and particularly through the Office of Federal Student Aid. The president obviously made a transformative announcement a couple of weeks ago, providing debt cancellation for up to 20 million Americans entirely and millions more for partial forgiveness, is conducting massive regulatory overhauls in federal financial aid, and simultaneously redesigning customer service platforms like studentaid.gov and the student loan servicing system, all of which is just a huge undertaking overall for the administration. So we really appreciate all that the administration is doing across the board to help improve student basic needs and help improve federal financial aid. That includes the not just Department of Education, but also the Food and Nutrition Service, which is actively working on guidance and flexibilities to help students access SNAP under the expanded eligibility they have now, and preparing for what will probably be an eventual end of the public health emergency that was declared for COVID-19 sometime later this year or early next. We are looking forward to some of the interagency work that the Food and Nutrition Service and Department of Education are doing to help expand access to public benefits for students. This is not only Department of Education, FNS, but it also includes the Treasury Department for things like the Child Tax Credit or Earned Income Tax Credit, Department of Health and Human Services for covered under the ACA or protecting students' access to abortion care, and the Federal Communications Commission to run the Affordable Connectivity Program. These are all incredibly important pieces of work. So with that, I know I've covered a bunch of elements of federal policy that are ongoing or have recently been put into practice. I'm so grateful that we had the chance just to be able to ground set and level set about all of the things that are priorities right now or are victories in the recent past, so that you can understand that progress on student basic needs security at the federal level and policy change at the federal level is happening. It's not enough, and we still have to do a lot more to make sure that we create systemic change that address students' non-tuition costs and very significant basic needs and security. But we're thrilled to be part of this movement and with other stakeholders who've been part of advocating for students' basic needs. And with that, I'd like to welcome someone who I have had the privilege of working with on a number of issues affecting students. As I mentioned, Ernest Ezeugo is a strategy officer for federal policy at the Lumina Foundation, which is an independent private foundation in Indianapolis, Indiana, not far from where I was born, actually, that is committed to making opportunities for learning available beyond high school for all young people and adults across the country. He's previously worked in roles at Young Invincibles, New America, State Higher Education Executive Officers, the New America Foundation, National Campus Leadership Council, and even the U.S. Department of Education. And as I mentioned, he recently served as a negotiator on a federal rulemaking panel on other college accountability issues, which we are so happy for and thank him for his public service in that effort. Ernest, I want to welcome you to the stage, and I'll invite you to give some remarks to our attendees today. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Bryce. Hello, everyone. Hello, Bryce. Thanks for having me today. I am really excited to be joining you to talk about federal higher education policy, not just because you, Bryce, have some serious expertise on this that I'm excited to learn from, but also because I think we're in a very interesting, slightly precarious moment in higher education right now, for which I think federal policy will make all the difference one way or another in the next year or so. In your remarks, you give us a really great summary of what has happened in higher ed policy at the congressional level, the administrative level, and what different parties have tackled when it comes to higher education policy recently. At Lumina, I've been thinking about what these actors must still do and how we can support, of course, the field and encouraging them to do so through the lens of our biggest issues right now. And I would go over those just briefly from my perspective to also help frame the conversation as you've done. But first, obviously, is that we're in the midst of a stop out and enrollment crisis in higher education, no doubt spurred by the pandemic. The National Student Clearinghouse data shows us that overall enrollment has declined by just over 4%. And those numbers are definitely worse, unfortunately, for historically underserved populations. It's just one example. The same report found that Black first-time full-time enrollment is down 6.5% compared to last spring. And that 4.1% number was also compared to last spring. That will almost certainly compound with the fact that we are staring down a decision from the Supreme Court on affirmative action and race-conscious admissions policy that are likely to roll back what institutions of higher education can do to encourage diversity in their classes, not to even speak of what chilling effects that decision will have on institutions that don't want to be the next plaintiff. And it's no doubt already compounding with the ways that the court's decision on Dobbs has affected higher education and the landscape, as was alluded to and discussed at length in an earlier session in this policy summit. So those are truly just a couple of examples of the issues I think that higher education is facing and will no doubt continue to deal with. And, we'll no doubt dive into those issues a little bit more deeply as we have our discussion here. But taken together, those issues really kind of paint a bleak picture for the progress we've made in expanding access to higher education. And I know I'm preaching to the choir a bit. I know the folks who are engaged with the Hope Center and the movement know a lot about this already. But today's students, being more diverse than the likes of what higher education has seen before, are also in some cases a little bit more susceptible to the issues that higher education is facing today and may face in the near future, because we're operating not totally as Bryce shared with us, but largely on rules and policy meant to serve a population of students in higher education that existed over a decade ago. So we'll dive into this. I'll stop waxing poetic here, but I'm excited to be talking with you today and to be thinking through how higher education policy can help students today, how it's helped students today, and then how we can prepare for what's to come.
Thanks, Ernest, and timely reminders about the impact of the court, both already with the Dobbs decision and coming down the pike potentially with affirmative action. It seems like an onslaught sometimes of changes that are attacking students. So I was glad that we could talk a little bit about some of the things that are that we're looking forward to on the federal policy level. And let's dive right in on the agency front, since you were just recently involved in that negotiated rulemaking panel. And I know you've been involved in lots of different administration efforts. We've got a lot going on right now. As I mentioned, debt cancellation, regulatory overhaul, servicing, implementation of the FAFSA Simplification Act. Where do you think the administration has the best chance of making an impact on college affordability in this particular moment, given everything that they're doing, everything that they're trying to achieve?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, the Biden-Harris administration's work over the past couple of years on student debt, of course, in the form of, one of the most recent and certainly one of the largest pieces around student debt cancellation, but also as it relates to the public service loan forgiveness waiver, the income-driven repayment waiver that came out, both of one of those which came out last year, the other that came out earlier this year, and work on a new, more generous income-driven repayment plan, not to mention the plan for giving borrowers who are defaulted on their student loans a fresh start as repayments resume. All of these things have been critical acknowledgments of the fact that transitioning to broad debt financing of higher education has been a painful, restrictive, even in some cases prohibitive move for millions of American families. So I think in the near term, I feel like those issues are where the administration stands the greatest chance of not just making an impact, but also, quite frankly, doing their part to help slowly restore the promise of higher education to the public and the promise of these critical programs that are meant to ease the burden and risk of people pursuing higher education to better their economic lot. And to that end, I just want to draw emphasis to the creation of this new income-driven repayment plan that we are looking at. The terms as they've been discussed so far are really it's really a move, I think, in the right direction, a move that I'm not sure many of us on the outside of kind of understanding what exactly the administration is up to really saw coming. And, I think that in particular will have significant impact especially for borrowers who have debt but no degree from their undergraduate education.
I'm so glad you mentioned debt cancellation, Ernest, because I think there are a lot of folks who work on the college affordability front and forward-looking, how do we reduce non-tuition costs, who don't necessarily draw the connection between what happens after the student leaves and is repaying their loans and sort of their work on the ground or how it impacts college affordability. But one of the things that we talk a lot about at the Hope Center is that student debt relief, particularly this most recent announcement, is really an acknowledgement of the problem of affordability, that it recognizes a systemic policy failure that was unfortunately intentional. Policymakers created programs that were not sufficient in meeting student need and actually resulted in there being an opportunity for state disinvestment and for students to accumulate that debt. So in so many ways, the federal government has made a recognition in a very profound way of the fact that student debt is not an individual failure, that student made a choice to acquire debt, but a policy failure, a systemic issue, and it is almost maybe apologizing for that mistake. Particularly, I think important is the decision to relieve an additional student debt amount for recipients of the federal Pell Grant. Which obviously has a significant impact on students with the least financial means. Do you see this way when you say it sort of maybe generates action toward addressing college affordability going forward? Do you think it's primarily through that acknowledgement that we have a failure, or is it going to be just more that policymakers feel a rush to need to address this on the congressional side?
Yeah, honestly, I feel both. I mean, it really can't be understated what the actions of the administration mean from the standpoint of an acknowledgement here. I mean, most students, not all, I'm willing to concede some are in it for different reasons, but most people move through higher education, especially certain programs that that kind of offer and promise better outcomes for students who might be looking maybe to re-enroll to better their economic lot, or maybe looking to enroll for the first time so that they may earn good jobs after they graduate and live an economically stable life. That is like the promise of higher education in this country. And so, of course, in kind of a policy world and space right now where we're spending a lot of time talking about the value of education and quite frankly, the ways that higher education has had to confront again questions about the worth and the cost of obtaining a degree and what that means for return on investment for students. The acknowledgement that, hey, quite frankly, the way that we have taken some of this and implemented some of this policy that has had harm on family, has caused harm for millions of families. That acknowledgement is a key step, I think, in the conversation around affordability, because, I won't say all the way up until this point, but to some extent up until this point, we've been having conversations about how to increase affordability of higher ed, drawing on ideas that we've talked about making college free, have talked about doing all this stuff in the future with little, I wouldn't say acknowledgement, but certainly little action towards people who may have felt like they had done everything that they could and done everything right to try to better their lot, and were met with circumstances much different from what they were promised. So I think certainly the acknowledgement is critical. And then I also think it started a conversation as well about what affordability looks like on the front end. And of course, I hope we will return to some proposals such as a federal-state partnership to lower the cost of college, but also what it looks like on the back end. Because, part of affordability is, once you earn that degree, for example, are you making enough money to pay off your debt and live a sustainable life? Like that is also part of the conversation, even if it's not typically framed or has not up to this point been framed as such. So both, I would really say, to your question.
I'm so glad you mentioned the free community college proposal and state-federal partnership, because as I was doing my broad overview of federal policy, obviously, so those were proposals that had been dropped or didn't quite make it to the finish line. I didn't cover them. But worth just noting that, even in what became the Inflation Reduction Act, it was originally Build Back Better, came closer than we ever had before to having potentially free community college, and then students be able to use Pell Grants for their non-tuition costs. So that could have had a transformative impact. And if we're ever going to see a state-federal partnership, obviously, it would probably go into an HEA reauthorization, or conversely, it might be hard to reauthorize an HEA without a state-federal partnership. You have to think about changing the system fundamentally. So just thanks for mentioning those things. I want to just, before we switch to sort of broader Congress dynamics, we were talking about all of these action steps that the administration is taking, the recognition they're providing around the significance of student debt. But obviously they're going to run into some challenges, right? We can expect that with so many things, there is obviously going to be things that get lost in the shuffle a little bit. Where do you think we might see the biggest log jams on the Biden administration side, given the
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've already seen some log jams and some complications, right, with the Department of Education's ongoing regulatory fixes. For example, there was a hope early on that with the negotiated rulemaking, the institutional and programmatic eligibility negotiated rulemaking earlier this year, that we might see notices for proposed rulemaking drop for a lot of the issues at that table, including, and with emphasis on gainful employment, might see those drop this year so that we could see implementations of these very critical rules as soon as next year. However, for a multitude of reasons, many understandable, sadly to say, including capacity at both the department and other critical agencies that are part of the regulatory process, we won't see an NPRM on gainful employment until next year, making the absolute earliest that gainful could go into effect, barring other hiccups, by the way. This is like if everything goes right from this moment forward, July 1st of 2024. And the complication there, of course, is that rules and regulations like gainful employment are critical to the way that we think about higher education, because they're a part of the tools that the administration has to hold institutions accountable for the quality of their programs that they have to offer. And I would also say, what happens on the Hill, especially as it relates to some of the proposals that we've heard throughout the course of this year and last around college completion and retention, does matter to the department as well. And while, and I'll have a lot of praise for this as we continue to talk about it, while of course it's really exciting to see the department, for example, launch their effort on college and completion grants, I think it was 5 million a couple of weeks ago. There's only limited funds to do that without continued authorization of funding coming from Congress. So to that end, there are also hiccups that there are understandable hiccups and log jams towards better and even more fruitful efforts for fighting basic needs issues on campus and in higher education that we might see as well.
And in terms of Congress making progress and providing some funding for completion grants or the basic needs grant program, and then the raft of pieces of legislation that did pass in the last couple of years, in particular, with the Future Act, FAFSA Simplification Act, even restoring year-round Pell Grants a few years ago, and so forth. While I'm biased as a former staffer myself on Capitol Hill, Congress was able to do a lot of things in a challenging environment. But a lot of folks are sort of often, pessimistic on the ability of Congress to make policy, and they usually use the classic example of the fact that HEA reauthorization has been stalled for a while. I guess just a question from me to you as someone who's seen this from outside. Do you think that Congress being stalled on HEA specifically is actually really reflective of a logjam? Is it that bad that we haven't had an HEA reauthorization? Or conversely, is it even possible to pass one in the current political environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, while I know you've made kind of your opinions clear on this, I would also love to hear some of your thoughts about this as well, just knowing the expertise you've had and the years that you spent on the Senate side. really getting a lot of this pushed through. I don't think it's fair to say that Congress is stalled on higher education policy. They're certainly not technically stalled on higher ed. I mean, in the past couple of years, granted as a part of the pandemic, we've actually seen some of the most significant investments in higher education come from Congress that we've seen in years and years and years. And colleges, institutions, quite frankly, have used those investments to do pretty amazing things, as you've alluded to and discussed, around basic needs, around mental health, around a number of different issues, kind of using that fund to step into the gap and really provide support for their students in what has been pretty tumultuous time. So I don't think it's technically fair to say that Congress is stalled on higher ed. I can certainly see why the perception exists, though, for reasons that you also brought up. We are 14 years and counting out from the last
since 2008. Yep.
Yeah, unless the successful reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, at least 9 years out from the last time it was supposed to be reauthorized, meaning, absent what progress has been made over the years since then in higher education, there's still many critical programs that the HEA reauthorizes that haven't been updated to the extent that today's students deserve for them to be updated at this time. A lot of higher education has changed, obviously, since 2008. Including the makeup of today's students. Again, don't need to preach to the choir to you all about that, but being that today's students are more diverse than they've ever been, being that we are looking at a different subsets of students who attend higher ed today that need different supports than back in 2008, of course those students deserve for one of the most significant pieces of legislation that focuses on higher education to be updated to reflect their needs as well. Right. And in the same vein, a lot of proposals that would have resulted in significant investments, even more investments towards higher education and towards supporting today's students, such as we talked about, free community college and the original total for the college completion and retention grants, I think was at 72 million or billion. I'm sorry, not million. Those
billion with a B. Yeah.
Right. Those being dropped from big spending bills has not helped the perception, I think, that Congress is stalled on higher ed. And of course, we saw it was protracted, but we saw a version of college completion and retention grants passed in the form of appropriations. We're seeing the department act on that now. But, I think it's fair to say, no, Congress is not stalled on higher ed, but also at the same time, if you look at the scale of issues that students face in higher education today, especially following the pandemic, and compare it to the scale of legislation sought to address those issues, it's not that nothing has been done at all, but there's so much more to do, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's a really great point, is that even if there's legislation happening, once a month, that it's not necessarily meeting the scale of the crisis that our students are facing on a day-to-day basis. I guess, you asked my opinion on this, and yes. I'm sort of, choosing to be a happy warrior and an eternal optimist that change is possible. It's not inconceivable. I think that Congress might, in a future Congress rather, might choose to try again on reconciliation and try again with a state-federal partnership, a nice college affordability, student success and college completion fund. And which was sometimes forgotten about in the America's College Promise Act, massive investment in an overdue investment in HBCUs, tribal colleges, yes, Hispanic serving institutions, and other MSIs, right? And just a tremendous advancement in affordability at those institutions as well. Is just, I think it's critical. So, we'll have to see. Obviously the next couple of years could be a little bit challenging politically. And then you mentioned, appropriations is still a place where there is active progress happening, and regularly Congress comes together to hike student aid on a bipartisan basis and make some tweaks and changes here. So I guess it's more like keep the ball rolling a little bit until we can get the momentum that we need in order to truly change the trajectory of college affordability. So I'm choosing not to be pessimistic about the chances for making change for higher education. And for students, regardless of whether it's reauthorization or any other vehicle.
Yeah, I'm with you. And let me quickly say also that to the end that so much has been done over the past couple of years, we all really should owe a debt of gratitude to the hardworking civil servants, such as you, having just come from the Senate, and the hardworking civil servants at the Department of Education and other agencies that are working on issues affecting today's students, because we know the landscape has been deeply challenging, and the perception may be what it is on like what Congress is able to do and what Congress has been able to accomplish on higher education. But no doubt, because of the efforts of you all, because of the efforts of members on the Hill, leaders at different agencies, there has been progress. And like that is my reason for being optimistic, is that we have smart people behind the scenes really working, who understand the issues and are working to kind of push things forward. So
that's so true. And I want to echo the thanks you're giving to all of the dedicated public servants out there who are in both the administration and in Congress dealing with an incredible, crushing amount of weight on their shoulders to implement the laws and meet the needs of their constituents. There's a lot, and as as an advocate on my side, a former advocate on yours, obviously we ask a lot, but obviously the urgency is high when it comes to meeting our students' needs. Maybe ending on a little bit of a high note, as we're thinking about sort of where does Congress go, or where does policy making go in general. A lot remains to be seen. What's going to happen in November, and we're a nonpartisan organization, so just purely looking at this from a policy lens, it's very clear that we have bipartisan disagreement about the role of the size of the federal government, where in particular on student loan policy and for-profit colleges. Where's an area that you think might get some bipartisan agreement or traction? You might actually see some further progress in the next couple of years, regardless of sort of how things might shake out with the elections in November.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this, and I'm actually going to cheat a little bit because you mentioned it before I got the chance to mention it in your summary. But I will say, like, one area that I'm particularly encouraged to see what has already happened by, and really do think there's a lot of great hope for bipartisan support and consensus in the next few years, is thinking about mental health, and particularly mental health as it relates to higher education. I mean, look, I can tell you from having been at organizations like National Campus Leadership Council, like Young Invincibles, students have been beating the drum on the concern that higher education has not done enough to tackle the mental health issues that students are facing for a long time, which gives me a lot. It gives me a lot of hope now that there is such energy and such movement towards thinking about mental health and how higher education, and particularly how federal policy, what levers are pullable at the federal policy level to really help higher ed tackle the problem. Again, we've seen a lot this year. You alluded to a lot of what's been discussed this year, conversations that have been had around mental health. We're seeing attention from kind of all corners of the administration on this. The department, Lumina Foundation just held an event with ACE recently, for which the Surgeon General appeared and gave remarks on the importance of thinking about mental health and education. There's a lot of movement right now, and I'm hopeful that in the next 2 years, as kind of all of the pieces of higher ed policy making work together, including advocates, including students who have been really bringing up these issues for years now, that we will see some consensus on the need or on the idea that there's a need to address mental health in higher ed. I think it's visible now, just to reiterate, I think it's visible now that people on both sides of the aisle understand that, hey, there's a crisis happening here that we need to address.
I'm glad you share my optimism on that particular piece of policy. For the attendees who are watching who did not get a chance to attend our mental health and suicide prevention session, I hope you'll pull that up once our recordings are available. We've seen a just dramatic increase in the amount of need that students have, with about 60% of students in higher education reporting significant anxiety or threat, but only about 40% actually seeking any treatment or being able to obtain any treatment. So huge barriers in access there. And obviously a deep connection with student basic needs security. If you are struggling to have enough food or find a safe place to live or childcare for your kids, you're going to be more stressed and anxious. A sort of obvious connection there between mental health and meeting students' basic needs and vice versa. So just thank you for raising that. And we're going to wrap up here. So Ernest, I just want to thank you so much for joining me for this chat on federal policy, sharing us your insights and your perspective from the different points of view that you've had, different spots in your public service journey, and insight onto where you see Congress administration making progress to impact college affordability, student success, equity, and so forth across the country. We really appreciate you joining us. So thank you very much, and I hope that you have a good rest of your week.
Thank you. Yeah, let me reflect that thanks to you as well, and the great work that the Hope Center is doing towards elevating and solving these issues.
Thank you. We look forward to continuing to partner with Lumina Foundation on all of the things we've talked about today.